which we have been playing really nice. Most of the stories have been nice, fun ones. This is the one that's going to sneak on there that's a little bit more of a legislative thing. Idaho bill seeks to ban public funding of transgender procedures. This comes by KTVB 7 by staff. The Idaho Legislature is currently considering House Bill 520, which, if passed, would prohibit the use of public funds for transgender medical care, including, quote, gender-affirming, end quote, surgeries and treatments like hormone therapy or puberty blockers. This bill extends the ongoing debate in Idaho over transgenderism and state-funded medical care. Co-sponsored by Representative Julie Young, a Republican from Blackfoot, the bill is a result of years-long conversations. It reflects the opinion of some Idahoans who believe that tax dollars should not be used for immoral medical procedures. During the committee vote, one community member testified that the use of Idaho's tax dollars for such treatments is against their faith and it is seen as, quote, repugnant, end quote. Opponents of the bill argue that they should have the right to use their medical coverage as they see fit. The ACLU of Idaho has criticized the bill as unconstitutional, stating that it restricts access to medically necessary care and would cause unavoidable harm to an already stigmatized community. While sponsors of the bill suggest that it could save the state money, the exact amount is unclear. Critics, including some lawmakers, counter that the potential savings would be offset by the cost of legal challenges that the state may face if the bill becomes law. House Bill 220 is part of a series of bills this legislative session that have focused on LGBTQ plus community, highlighting the ongoing legislative scrutiny of the transgender issue in Idaho. Which I'm not going to go super deep into the moral things of transgenderism because I think we've done that a lot on the show and stated our position. And so I do not want to bore the viewers, so we're not going to focus quite as much on that. But the first part I really want to start off with is why the state has the right to say what it wants to do with this money or have a criteria to do it. You know, if we sit there and say, well, no, the state doesn't have a right to say what it can do with, and when it gives people money, taxpayer money, right, it can't have strings attached, which me and John have talked about. It will have strings attached. It will always have strings attached. And making the argument that I think it very much should. The legislature has a right. You know, if you want to spend your own money and you have that money, then you have full freedom to spend it, right, in that sense, on lawful things and the way that you perceive you want to do that. But that, on the flip side, when you're talking about money, I think the state has all right to sit there and be like, no, due to the elected representatives and the way that they're elected, they fully have the right to say where those funds can and can't go.
Well, not only do they have the right, I think they have the responsibility. I think that's something that we as the American people have really gotten away from is what is the responsibility of the government? And the government is there to govern responsibly based on a moral code. That moral code is a Christian moral code here in the United States. It's what has driven our nation to the great heights that it has.
Right.
And part of that moral code is that we do not allow for that which we believe is, to borrow language, morally repugnant. And so if the Idaho legislature, the people that we have voted in to govern us, if we as an electorate decide that that is a morally repugnant thing and that the government should not spend money on it, well, then it is what it is.
And in this discussion, one core part of this that I think is the linchpin here, again, I'm not going to go too far down this road, but the argument often made, and I had to do some corrections on the script accordingly, is that the opposing side very regularly wants to argue or said it as, well, this is transgender medical care, which implies that, for instance, that it's necessary care. It is a necessity like heart care or, I don't know, respiratory care or something, that this is how people are born, which, you know, I don't think I'm too far off the farm looking at the rest of human history. Male and female, that's what we got. And so if you believe on that premise, then funding-wise, we should be voting and saying, no, we that's one thing. If you want to spend that money, we can have that discussion down the road if we should allow people to have these surgeries, right, to let doctors do them. But it's another thing when you're saying you want to do it on the taxpayer dime. We as the taxpayers have a say if we feel comfortable with our money going to fund that certain procedure, or I would argue that mental confusion that you have, you really need some help in that. But I think the taxpayer has all right to say, no, I don't want my money going to fund that for you. You need to do that. And, you know, one of the one of the arguments that's given here, what was it? Opponents argue that it should have the right to use their medical coverage as they see fit. If you are using state Medicaid, you've foregone the right to decide kind of where that coverage goes. It's meant to be for the needy that it just needs some coverage, right? And at that point, beggars can't be choosers. So if you're on Medicaid, if you're on that thing, then yeah, you don't have the right to decide all aspects of how that coverage works. Now, if you have a private medical provider, I could see the ground being made that cool, you can have more of that discussion. That's its own thing. But in this case, that argument I feel like is so very weak, and it makes it sound like the government has to always have no strings attached for its Medicaid, but then the left wants tons of strings attached to other things. And then I guess that brings me to the second point I really wanted to make on this, which in Idaho, in a broader sense, this is, I think, just a natural progression of the laws that you're seeing our legislature and the people we're electing, right, as John talked about, progressing. Last year, we passed a bill, which is currently fighting its way through the courts, saying that you can't do these procedures on minors. Well, what premise does that bill accept? It accepts that the act of doing gender changes is not really great. You're not going to prevent something that's really great for minors, right? If it's the best thing ever, then you want to do it as young as possible for a person in a sense, right? But with transgenderism, you can't try to transition or get all those hormone treatments until you turn 18. Well, then you start nudging the ball the other way. Well, if it's not good for 18, then is it really good for adults then? And that would be this next nudge going in that logical direction with this law.
Yeah, I follow you where you're going with that. And it seems like that's the direction that our legislature is going, is that they're following the science like, so many people ask them to do. Because if you look at the numbers on transgender surgeries, they don't actually reduce anything. Now, you can say that the studies that are done and the numbers that come out of those studies are not well-founded, and that's okay. You can argue against those studies, but those are the studies that we have. Those are the numbers that we have. It's what we've got. And so far as I'm aware, we try to base our medical decisions based on what information we have. Now, given the COVID debacle, we know that science is not always followed. The dollar is what is followed. And so what we do know is that gender-affirming care surgeries do not actually help anything, but they do make a whole lot of money for the medical community. So it seems like a bunch of people are being led that direction, not for the betterment of humankind, but for the betterment of someone's pocketbook.
Which is not good. And on the one hand, I'm fully going to be an advocate sitting here and advocating for capitalism, right? I think it's the best economic system that currently exists to bring the greatest amount of prosperity to all classes. Because whether you like it or not, society's going to have its different hierarchies. Hierarchies are not a bad thing. It's going to happen, but you want to make sure that everyone, hopefully, in all those hierarchies is doing pretty great. But one of the sad disadvantages, because every system has a disadvantage, with capitalism is its focus on the financial side. And so you're seeing that here. And that's where you also, there again, as we've talked about many times in the show, and I will not get too far on my pulpit, need to be involved and in these laws and regulations so that businesses aren't dictating how legislation moves, but you're dictating how legislation moves.
Yeah. So the term that gets bandied around is that government is downstream of culture. And I think this is one of those instances where that is absolutely true. Culture right now is saying that there is no distinction between man and woman and you can be whatever you want, although it's also saying that you are born into the body you're born into and you can't change that.
Not logical statements.
Right. None of these statements actually are logically consistent. But therefore, our government, which is downstream of those logical inconsistencies, our government is also logically inconsistent. So therefore,
Teach
the question
logic
is,
in schools, please.
Well, so that's kind of where I was getting with that is how do we change this? How do we move the Titanic so we're not headed to that iceberg? Well, it starts with our children. If you have your children in a public school where they're being fed this nonsense, that might be a thing to start with. You might really need to get a handle on where your kids are at, what they're doing, what they're being taught. If you have the means to, I would suggest pulling them out of that public school I personally think homeschooling is the best way, but there are a plethora of other options other than the public school system.
And to those people who don't have a lot of money, right, and say it is a financial thing, right, and you're legitimately being like, hey, I'm not spending a bunch of money on the boat and my hobbies and a bunch on trips and stuff. We're scraping by, man. we are scraping by. Then the advice or thing I would give to that person to maybe change your stuff is, one, spend time with your children. Obviously, I know you're scraping by, so that probably means you're really busy, but try to do that. And then secondly, for all its flaws and everything, get involved in the public school system. It does still have a framework that's supposed to be representative in some kind. Go to your school board meetings. Be involved in that. Start making and chipping away at it so that the future generation doesn't have to deal with some of the things that we're dealing with now.